Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back. Super excited to be talking with you guys today. There's a few different shows that I wanted to do. So what you may end up seeing, particularly if you are watching me on YouTube, is you might see me in the same outfit. And because I had so many different ideas, that I was, writing them down furiously. And I guess it just depends on how my voice is going and how I'm feeling. And if I could power through the ideas for shows that I've written down. And I got bit by the creative bug. So I've got like 3 full pages here of notes of shows that I wanted to do. So we'll see, what we can get through. But anyhow, super excited to be chatting for you guys. In addition, I have a surprise for you. So, we, my assistant and I, we went back and we have some episodes, the Lost Files, or episodes that I've recorded over the years. And some of them I like, and I didn't release them because there were some that I couldn't find because they were on an older computer that I don't have, or I don't really use anymore because it has issues. And then, or 2, because when I have ideas for shows, I kind of like for shows to go in a certain sequence. Sometimes I want to push shows out more than others, or whatever, the deal is. But anyhow, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be releasing some of the lost episodes that you guys didn't get to see. So I'm sharing that with you because it's my gift to you. For if you've been a long time listener, welcome back, and thank you for your support. If you're new, welcome. But it's my gift to you. And then also too, you may see me look a little bit different because, this show has been on for almost 8 years. So, these are shows that have been, done over the 8 years. And, so I'm really blessed to have done this show and really grateful to you guys for watching. So that is our little way of thanking you, to kind of sprinkle those in. So you might get a couple of episodes here or there. So just as an FYI, so if you see one with like the lost episodes, then the logo on there, then you'll know what that's all about, and you'll know why we're releasing that to you. Bam. All right. So I'm in a little bit of a different spot today. I wanted to kind of change some things up and just kind of get a new vibe going for the show. And my lovely assistant, she's been trying to get me to do this for some time, and I've been very resistant, but she's the creative, in terms of the artistic, in terms of what it looks like on the eyes. And, so, I've been listening to her, and she's like, oh, do this, do that. So we always talk about ways in which we can improve the show. Um, all right. So I've been working on a lot of things, and I've had a lot of different careers over the years, right? And in terms of not just mental health, but also in healthcare, and working within animal healthcare and all these kind of things. So I kind of want to talk about kind of, draw from those today, and what gave me the idea to sort of draw from those other aspects of careers that I've had over, my lifetime, is that I've recently attended a neuropsych assessment seminar, and I used to do neuropsych assessment quite a bit as part of my internship training, and then went into corrections and did some assessment, but not as much as I did prior to when I worked at the hospitals and stuff like that. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about like you know other causes of narcissism and just kind of give you guys an idea because I think people have this idea that narcissism looks one way or it's caused by this one thing, it's trauma, it's this, it's that, and so I've seen it show up albeit in very rare cases in other ways, and where it's not necessarily organic or congenital, meaning that someone just didn't develop it naturally over the progression of their lifetime. But I wanted to talk with a little bit about that, and maybe this is a little bit more educational. Hopefully, you find it useful or at least interesting. Um, one of the things that I used to do, which I don't do too much anymore, at least I haven't done it recently. I'll put it to you that way. Um, if the opportunity presents itself, I certainly would do it. But I used to provide counseling to professional athletes. And normally, when I do counseling for professional athletes, it's usually when they've done something and they've gotten themselves into a world of trouble that they're typically not going to get out of, and so they're probably going to have to do some serious time or whatever crime that they committed. Um, and so one of the things that I notice, in particular, the ones that I've worked with over the years are the ones that are very heavy contact sports. So football players, MMA, fighters and things like that. So when you work with those guys or those people, and I would say guys for me because I've mostly worked with men who've done it, and I recognize that there are women who play those sports as well. But for context, for me, I've worked a lot with guys who have done it. And, one of the things with those guys, of course, it's now making its way into mainstream media a lot more is they have the CTE or head injuries or things like that. And typically they're very, very young. They're in their 20s, and they've been knocked around and, hit their head a lot during their sports. And so they may have had, concussion. And so, or they've had, CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is basically, what you're looking at is you're looking at degenerative, people that have, knocked their brain around. And so when you think of neurologically the brain is encased in several layers of like fine tissue, and then it's got the skull, which is the protective head covering. But inside of the skull, there's actually like sharp. The skull actually has like these sharp projections on the inside of it, and so whenever you maybe have a car crash or you have a contact where you have fallen and hit in your head, your brain is going to go back and forth against those sharp projections, right? And therefore it could potentially cause injuries, especially if you continue to do that a lot over time, or if the impact is severe enough that is very detrimental, where you are knocked unconscious per se, or there is some sort of TBI. And believe it or not, at least in my training and what I've seen, typically closed head injuries are known to cause more injuries, or more impairment, I should say, not injuries, but more impairment than open head injuries. And that's not all the time, but a lot of the times more people see more of an impact from closed head injuries, and there's more of an effect on their character and who they are. And prognosis depends on how long it takes for them to recover from that injury. And sometimes people, if they're not seeing improvement in symptoms after 6 months or more, prognosis might not be good, or they could sustain permanent damage from their head injury. And then a lot more people now, what you're starting to see is you're starting to see people who, once they get up there in years, then they start to really see the impact of CTEs and things like that. And then there's famous cases like the football player Aaron Hernandez, and I know that there was a point in time in which they were trying to utilize CTE as a defense for his case. And I don't really know a whole lot about that case, like in terms of the ins and outs and all of that kind of stuff. But I do know that there was some suggestion that CTE may have an impact on his behavior. And there's a lot um, that I think goes into that, but that I do think that there is an impact of concussion or head injuries on behavior, particularly when you talk about young men who are in their early 20s, right? Because brain development, it takes longer for the brain to develop in men than it does in women. And so brain development, particularly the frontal lobe, isn't fully developed until you get into your later 20s. So you're talking about 26 through 29. And so when you talk about frontal lobe, a lot of that has to do with like impulse control and executive functioning. And what happens if you are consistently damaging the area, one, that's not fully developed, but two, that is in charge of executive functioning. You get people that are highly impulsive, right? And continue to have trouble managing impulsivity, impulse control, and things like that. And so that's where you get into people committing crimes and getting themselves caught up in behavioral issues, and where they become violent and maybe even sociopathic in some cases. And so that's an area of where I've seen, and it is very real, and unfortunately, seen some folks get into some big trouble over the years because of that. But again, largely in those folks who have heavy contact, such as boxers, MMA, and football, that are very violent. And I know of some men who have come out and shared a lot more about, their violence and their rage, and things like that. And I do think that, head injury has a lot to do with that, which we're finding out a lot more about that. Um, as time goes on. If you watch the last episode, I talked a lot about how I used to work in a medical rehabilitation center, which is for people who recover from any number of severe debilitating medical issues, such as gunshot wounds and, things where they're paralyzed, or ventral or locked-in syndrome, which is basically where somebody is confined to their bed and they can't move, but they still have brain activity. Lots of different things. HIV is also, or HIV, which is then turned into AIDS, is also one that I worked a lot with in rehabilitation centers and things like that. And one of the things that I think I don't think it gets a lot as much of attention as it should, but I think it definitely has a large impact on development of narcissism and antisocial traits, particularly when you get older, is and again, this falls under degenerative neurological disorders, but I think the one main substance that I think impacts people, in addition to methamphetamine, but I think alcohol use. So a person who is a chronic alcoholic, alcohol is a very dangerous drug, and there are a lot of people in rehabilitation centers that have medical issues that are caused by chronic long-term alcohol use, such as cirrhosis of the liver is one thing. But the other one that I think of most when I think of degenerative is Wernicke Korsakoff's syndrome. And I know I'm probably saying it right. I think it's actually supposed to be Wernicke Korsakoff syndrome. So the W is pronounced as a V. But Korsakoff syndrome is it's so interesting when you see it. But basically, it's caused by chronic alcohol use, which then turns into a thiamine deficiency. And thiamine is a B vitamin. That's why you know, if you catch it early enough, like because alcohol is a diuretic, which basically means that you're going to flush out a lot of nutrients, and one of them is the B vitamin, which your body naturally has. But if you flush out too much of it, a lot of people, if they catch it early enough, and if they have a good doctor, a good medical doctor, and they'll catch it on their blood work, you know, they can go in and have B vitamin shots and counseling around alcohol use. But if people aren't, which a lot of people aren't, if they don't care about going to the doctor, or they're just not, they're so deep in their addiction that that's not their primary focus, then you get that thiamine deficiency, which then becomes permanent. And again, if you catch it early enough, it's treatable, it's preventable, you know, before it gets to that. But with Korsakoff syndrome, you know, one of the hallmarks of it is like again that lack of impulse control. You have confabulation, which confabulation is like when people can't actually remember something, so they just sort of lie and fill in the blanks about things that actually happen. So they're just kind of chronically making up stuff. They're constantly trying to feed their addiction. And again, if you watch my last episode on rehabilitation centers, substance abuse is rife. And then not only that, but people are trying to support their addiction. So they'll steal from other people, and they'll steal their finances. You know, the other vulnerable people that are within a rehabilitation sniff. You don't really see it too much in hospice. I've worked in hospice too, and so you don't really see too much of that. But a skilled nursing facility and rehabilitation, you definitely see it. And the other thing is, like I said, the impulse control. So you know, impulse control can look like someone who, and which I've had this happen. Unfortunately, is like someone who becomes so inebriated and impulsive that they just might whip out their penis in front of the public and pee all over themselves. You know, and then they get like super nasty and super grouchy at, you know, their personality changes just like that. And they can become super violent, super aggressive. And in fact, it's very unfortunate because, again, in certain rehabilitation centers, and I haven't worked in rehabilitation in quite some years, so probably been about 10 years or so now. So I'm not sure how they work in terms of managing things like that, but I know when I was doing it, you know, Medi-Cal, which if you live in other parts of the United States, it's called Medicaid. Medicaid wouldn't cover treatment of Korsakoff syndromes, any sort of substance-induced medical disorders. Medi-Cal would not cover that. Medicaid didn't cover that. Again, I don't know if some things have changed, and so you would have to, you know, you'd have to kick people out of the facility, and so you would see their behavior become quite aggressive and violent because they really didn't have a place to go because their addiction had taken so much of a hold of their life. And so that was really unfortunate. But and then not to mention that, you know, insurance wasn't going to cover that disorder. And again, I don't know if anything has changed in the insurance coverage, specifically Medi-Cal, Medicare. And so maybe now they've adapted to more or less treat something like that, but it definitely becomes neurological. And seen some very unfortunate cases where people just became super aggressive and super violent, and there was a rapid shift in their personality due to decompensation. And I'm sorry if I'm using some big words on this podcast. I usually try to keep it layman's terms instead of being super clinical. But um, you know, sorry about that. Other neurodegenerative disorders would be Alzheimer's, and AIDS, and which could cause some severe personality changes. Alzheimer's in particularly, which you can have AIDS-based Alzheimer's too, but with Alzheimer's, typically what you see, particularly within the second stage of Alzheimer's, like first stage Alzheimer's, people are like loosely forgetful, right? They don't remember things, or their memory is they're just having challenges with memory. But typically in the second and third stages is where you see people that are frustrated with their forgetfulness, and frustrated with what's going on because they don't understand. So the brain is being more impacted. There's much more degeneration that's happening over that period of time. And typically what you see with Alzheimer's in particular is like people can become very childlike or teenager like. They can also become volatile and violent, and so they can become aggressive, especially if they don't know who you are, or if they're just having some challenges within the day, and there's not really a lot of rhyme or reason to it, except that there's some degeneration of the brain tissue that's going on. And so you start to see some drastic personality changes. And it's really sad for people, that try to take care of their family members. And then they're also trying to grapple towards mom or dad or grandpa or whoever, then becoming violent or sexually inappropriate, or, something, threaten to kill them or something like that, with Alzheimer's. Um, Another one that's also a brain disorder, which I have only had the pleasure of seeing this once once in my career, in my many years of doing mental health. And I say pleasure because it's one of those things that's like is really interesting to see. And this is something that cannot be faked. Is seizure disorder. If you have seizure disorder, and I say that because this was early on in my mental health career. Now they have a lot better things to manage it. But if you have a seizure disorder or severe brain wave activity disorder, something along those lines, is that many years ago when I worked at the psych hospital, you had a gentleman brought in that had some seizure like activity. And then every time every time you would sort of see it, and you have the EEG and things like that hooked up, but every time you see it, his personality would drastically change. And he would become aggressive and violent and things like that. And it was like, you could just actually, it was interesting to see it because you could see it on the monitor, like the change, and then the activity, and then his character just sort of changed drastically into this alternate ego like person. And again, it's very rare. That's very rare that something like that happens, where you could actually see that. But it was, in the DSM, we have something called where, where you have any sort of psychiatric disorder, but it can be caused by a generalized medical condition, or a medical condition, I should say. And so that's an example of how you can see things caused by a medical condition. With seizure disorder, with with medical and mental disorders run on a spectrum. Typically, a lot of times, if you have one particular medical disorder, you can have a mental disorder on the other end of that spectrum. And that's why so many medications for medical disorders are also interchangeable with psychiatric disorders, because those medications were developed to treat disorders on a spectrum. And so you could sort of track things based off of fetal fetal development, right? Because if the fetus, like a developing baby, develops a certain medical condition, chances are they're going to have a certain psychiatric condition, to correlate with that. And I learned that way back when I used to do research and stuff like that back on genetics. Again, that was another career a lifetime ago. But you could sort of track certain things. So if you, for example, if you have a skin condition, a lot of people who have skin conditions are also going to have heart conditions and, depression and so on and so forth. So a lot of medications are developed on a spectrum. And so for seizure disorder, there's, the psych medications have changed a lot over the years. And there's certain medications that lower the seizure threshold. So you have to have medications that sort of counteract that. And you always have to watch for that when you're prescribing medications for a person with seizure disorder, because it can definitely impact psychiatric symptoms. So those are the medical conditions that come to my mind in terms of causing, narcissistic traits or antisocial traits. But a lot of it has to do with, mostly degenerative brain disorders and or substance abuse, specifically alcohol abuse. Speaking of things being on a continuum, alcohol abuse, when it becomes severe enough, if you are addicted to it severely enough, it can definitely cause seizures. It can cause hallucinations and things like that. And once it gets to that point where you're that dependent on it, it can become deadly. And so it's not recommended that you detox from that on your own without medical intervention. So I think that's a good example of how like medical and psychiatric and substance abuse disorders can be on a continuum is severe alcohol dependence. And things like that, not to mention what it can cause on the liver. There's people that have to go into the hospital and have to have their liver drained, where you put the pump in and it just sort of drains all this fluid off the liver because of the substance abuse over the years. Methamphetamine is another substance. Yeah, I've worked a lot with folks that have been addicted with methamphetamine. Specifically, a lot of folks complain that say that methamphetamine heightens the desire to have sex. So I worked a lot with people who were sex offenders, whether that be child sex offenders or just sex offenders in general, who would commit a lot of sexual crimes when they are high off of methamphetamine. And, one of the things that they oftentimes talked about is how, they would be hypersexual for 24 hours. And so they're just wanting to have sex for that 24 hours. And they would become, opportunistic in terms of the types of sexual crimes that they would commit. So meaning that anything or any person that they have access to, they're going to, try to take sexual advantage of that for the simple fact that meth really just sort of makes them hypersexual. So that's another substance. And so for me, the jury's still out on that, because I didn't do as much research with methamphetamine. I just know that I've worked with a lot of criminals and people who committed crimes over the years, and a lot of them have committed more severe crimes while they were high on methamphetamine. So I'm not really sure, but again, amphetamines in general, it runs on a spectrum in terms of causing, again, mental and medical disorders. So, people that are on methamphetamine long enough, it causes degenerative issues, which is why, folks that have long-term or heavy methamphetamine usage, even when they're younger, they develop symptoms that are very similar to schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or anything on the schizophrenia spectrum, some derivative of that. And a lot of times, if their usage is long enough, Those symptoms are irreversible, so they become luridly psychotic. They may have personality changes related to that. They hear voices, see things. Seeing things is as rare, but hearing voices and things like that is fairly common with people who have long-term and heavy methamphetamine usage. Another thing that I think can attribute to causing narcissism is habituation. It's a form of non-associative learning in which a non-reinforced response to a stimulus decreases after repeated or prolonged presentations of that stimulus. So that's the jargony way of it. So with habituation, it's um, so you look at it as this way, in my most simplest way of explaining it to you. So, for example, and this is so when a child may act up or do something that they're not supposed to do, a parent may discipline that child, and that child learns as a result of being disciplined, hey, I shouldn't do that anymore. Right? Because I don't want to be disciplined anymore. Or I don't want to have that punishment, or that punishment was unpleasant. I didn't like it. And so therefore I'm not going to act up anymore. So with habituation though, a child may act up, parent punishes them, and then that punishment then has no impact on that child's behavior, or that child may sort of scoff or laugh at that punishment like it doesn't faze me, or that didn't hurt, right? And so you have to watch that, because when you have a child that's sort of acclimated to punishment, or punishment no longer phases them, a lot of times what you run into are parents that then become super abusive towards their children, because um they feel like, okay, well, that didn't do anything, so I'm gonna discipline you even more, or I'm gonna discipline you even harder, particularly when it comes to physical abuse or corporal punishment. I'm gonna give you more of it because those one or two hits didn't do anything. And so when a child becomes when they sort of accommodate or they acclimate to punishment, you have is a parent that's overutilizing them and being brutal towards them, right? And so that can be part of the trauma response, where it's like, that doesn't faze me. And if I think about this movie, I think a good example of it would be like oh gosh, there's a movie from many years ago where little Kevin from Home Alone, Macaulay Culkin played this boy who had behavioral issues. It was a movie called The Good Son. And I think that movie demonstrates habituation, where he's just like, he doesn't care. He's not fazed by punishment. He's like, it actually sort of turns him on, because in that movie, he's a very deviant child, causing a lot of harm towards people. And so, people sort of acclimate to habituation, and it would happen a lot even in prison where I worked, where I used to work. Is interesting because in prison, I'm a clinician, and so I'm working with inmates, and then there's a part of it, like if you work in a prison, you have to still be a disciplinarian no matter what job you work. If you have any interactions with inmates, you have to be willing to sort of write people up when they're inappropriate, when they're over familiar, and when they do things that they shouldn't do. And an inmate is always going to be an inmate, so they're always going to try and do things that they know they shouldn't be doing, right? Because that's part of their personality. It's part of the reason why they're in there. And so part of that is learning how, or having to discipline people for inappropriate behavior. And I would just, you know, whenever I would have to write someone up, or discipline someone in terms of a write up for something that they shouldn't be doing, excuse me, for something that they shouldn't be doing, every now and then they would like really like it, and they would like sort of get in there and talk about it with other people. And then it would be like the center of attention. And it would just be this like glorified thing where it's like, oh, look, Dr. Jones gave me a punishment, whatever. And this is like the greatest thing ever. And, it was almost like this reverse thing where it's just like, whatever. But that's a prime example of like punishment where it's meant to deter you from acting out anymore, and it's meant to keep everybody safe within the institution, but instead it becomes like this glorified badge of honor, if you will. Um, Another thing that I think contributes to narcissism is, we live in the US, and I recognize I have a lot of people outside of the US who watch the show, but mainly in the US, we are an individualistic society, whereas other countries and other cultures are collectivist society, meaning that, when you're an individualistic, it's like every man for himself. Collectivistic, it's like, no, we're one here. My family, we're all one here. We're part of a community. And I think within an individualistic society itself, it is survival of the fittest. It's only the strong survive. It's sort of that concept. So like you have to sort of make it on your own. If you don't, then this isn't meant for you and you're in the wrong place, buddy. And so I think any place that sort of breeds this like, every man for himself mentality, then you automatically have competition for survival, for resources and things like that. And it manifests in different ways, right? Now you're starting to see people who like are sort of fighting to be a celebrity on social media and fighting for following, fighting for likes and things like that. So it shows up in different ways, right? And where we're looking for that, because if you like me, then I'm going to get paid, or I'm going to get more of a following. I might get more of a brand deal. I might get more endorsements and things like that. And so it can manifest in different ways. So that survival of the fittest. I think another way in which it manifests, narcissism can manifest, particularly with parenting, is you have the laissez-faire parenting, where it's sort of this laid back approach, like whatever my child wants, I'm going to give them. So I'm going to not really enforce the rules, where you have, on one hand, you have parents that overly try to enforce and that are overly brutal. And then you also have those other ones that are bordering child neglect, but also giving their child anything that they want, right? And where you're sort of like overly rewarding your child, for behavior that isn't necessarily good, or you're trying to be your child's friend and you're just sort of giving them all the material goods, and you can't really say no to your child, right? And so your child learns very early on that whatever I want is mine for the taking. My parents will give it to me. I don't have to really work for it. I don't have to have a deep appreciation for it. Or if I get in any sort of trouble, my parents are definitely going to bail me out and they're going to take care of me, type thing. And then lastly, one thing that I'll mention is like parents that are extremely neglectful of their children. I think when you have parents that are very neglectful, I used to work with children a long time ago, but you have children that are kind of, that are left unattended for very long periods of time without, sometimes without food or water or access to resources and things like that, that are left for long periods of time by themselves, and they learn to have to fend for themselves. They don't really have any sort of social or emotional stimulation, and so they may develop addiction to things that are filling of their time, such as TV, video games, porn, those things that are mostly fantasy based, that are not real, but the child develops a perception that they have, that sort of fills this void in their imagination, and that they feel like they have some sense of control over, like, I can control video games, I can control pornography, I can control these things. And so those are whenever I whenever I work with someone who excessively indulges in those things, so you can kind of see, you can sort of trace back where that comes from. Anyhow, there's a lot more things. So this list isn't conclusive, but these are just some things that I thought of, because I went to my training seminar. And so there are some things, those are just some thoughts that I wanted to share with you. And of course, before I hop on out of here, don't forget, down in the show notes, we're going to have the two webinars that I'm doing 4 hours each on down low. Either you are a woman recovering from a down low partnership, or you are a man who is trying to get out of the down low lifestyle, or you're at least you're wanting to explore what it would mean for you to come out of that, or what else you can do about that. So those are 4 hours each, and those will definitely be posted in the show notes. And I appreciate you guys for watching. So until next time, take care and be well.